Hi, everyone. Today I'm going to introduce you to the idea of rhetorical analyses, and we're going to talk about how to write a rhetorical analysis, which you'll be practicing later on this week. So to start off with, I'm going to give some definitions so that you can understand, because sometimes we hear words like rhetorical and analysis, and we can get a little overwhelmed with what those mean. So let's break them down. First up, we have the definition overall of a rhetorical analysis can be split into the words rhetorical, meaning referring to something being expressed in terms intended to persuade or to impress. Not impress in the sense of, make someone be sort of jealous or inspired or things like that. It's more about giving an impression, okay? So anything that is rhetorical is referred to something that is expressed persuasively. So arguments that use rhetoric are persuasive arguments that try to impress an idea or a concept or a belief or an opinion onto their audience. And analysis, we've already talked about a little bit, but we'll continue to develop our analysis because that's really what makes this course so unique, is that we're going to focus on bringing our analysis into those higher levels of critical thinking, including analysis in the form of a detailed examination of the elements or structure of something. So you've probably heard me mention before that analysis refers to something being broken down into smaller parts or pieces. So a rhetorical analysis is an analysis of how an author argues rather than what an author argues. So we're going to start to look at some of the basic underlying structure of how arguments are made. And we've already taken a look at this by looking at quotations, so finding strong evidence, and then also asking ourselves those critical thinking questions of like, why does this matter? Or, who should care about this topic? Or what is its larger significance, possibly to a specific audience? So when we're doing a rhetorical analysis, we're taking a look at how an author or a speaker formulates their argument, transmits that argument, and gives a sort of persuasive or a specific impression on their audience. So we're looking at how did they do it, not what did they do. So an example of this would be somebody who is studying film would not necessarily be looking at like, was the movie a good movie? Like, did they enjoy the plot? Did they enjoy the story? That's more about screenwriting. But instead, they'd look at how did the director use different camera lenses or different widths or different things like jump cuts, things like that. Or perhaps how did they use things like a movie soundtrack to convey certain elements of the film. So that's something that might be a useful analogy for some of you who like to study other things. It's not necessarily the outcome that we're looking at. We're looking at the structural elements. So that's what we're doing in a rhetorical analysis, is taking a closer look at not what the author's argument is, but rather how they used various structural elements in order to make that argument. So what we do is we take a look at what are called the rhetorical features of a text. The first one is the author's situation. So who is the author? What is their background? What is their knowledge on the subject? Why are they possibly inspired to speak about, write about, research this particular topic? All of those things can be considered the author's situation. The author's situation is also influenced by their own personal lives and backgrounds. And so we don't always know that information about the author, but there are certain things that we can take a look at to see how does this inform the argument that they're making. So a perfect example of this would be to look at politicians and consider how are they influenced by their own personal situations to speak about or legislate about the issues that they do. We also want to take a look at their purpose. So closely related to their situation is often their purpose for writing. So, think about some of the reading that you've done this semester and ask yourself, is it clear what the author's purpose is for this writing? And also closely related to that is thinking about who is their intended audience. So choose any writer, any speaker, maybe you've watched like a TED Talk or something. Think about who are the people that they are hoping are their intended audience. So an intended audience could be the people who they want to read their book, the people who they want to attend their talk, the people they want to engage with their material. All creators have an intended audience, and that is one of the rhetorical features of a text, because whoever the intended audience is going to impact the way that the argument or the persuasive rhetorical devices that are used are employed. And of course, we want to take a look at the actual claims that they're making. So the kinds of claims that they're making, are they making sort of more fact-based, scientific-based claims? Are they looking at things and formulating opinion or subjective kinds of claims? And this also ties into looking at the evidence that they use. So obviously, persuasive arguments can be made with a variety of different types of evidence. And we've seen that in some of the readings that we've done. There's different types of evidence. Sometimes there are concrete pieces of evidence from research studies. Other times there are anecdotal examples, which just means like stories from actual human beings who experience something in that same arena. Looking at the various types of evidence can help us to understand how the argument is being made. And all of this is to show how the argument tries to persuade the reader. So you probably, as you were reading some of the reading assignments this semester, you have felt either persuaded or recognized that you were not persuaded by the author's argument. In this exercise, in performing a rhetorical analysis, we're going to take a look at how does the author successfully or sometimes unsuccessfully persuade their audience. And so we want to zoom out a little bit from our own personal experience of like, I didn't find this persuasive or I did find this persuasive, and think more in terms of the general strength of their argument in terms of how persuasive is it to the intended audience, right? Sometimes we're not persuaded by something, but we're also not the intended audience. So we can't really use our own personal experience. And rather, we're going to sort of zoom out a little bit and see how strong is this person's argument, how strong is their skill of persuasion, and then also to look at how did they achieve that strength in their argument, in their argumentation. So the structure of a rhetorical analysis is, it's pretty clear. We start with a short, neutral summary of the text. The keyword here is neutral. We are not going to comment. We're not going to include our own personal opinions in the summary of the text. So I know I've talked a lot about, how we want to avoid writing kind of book report summaries. And that's when we're writing analysis. Like, for example, in an essay, I don't want to see this kind of book report type writing because it actually belongs somewhere else. It belongs here in a rhetorical analysis. So that short neutral summary is almost like if you were to condense the ideas that you've been reading about into 1 to 2 sentences. Imagine that you're explaining what the text is about to someone you know. They wouldn't sit around while you read, 50 pages of it, but they would probably want to hear about it if you condensed it to a sort of short summary of the text. And then you want to keep that keyword in there, neutral, for a purpose, because we'll talk later about how we can include our subjective opinion when we take the rhetorical analysis and we apply it to formulating our own argument in a future assignment. So a thesis statement is not a thesis statement of your own creation. This is actually your own understanding of the author's thesis. So again, we're going to keep ourselves out of it. A rhetorical analysis is not about our own personal subjective experience. And it's also not yet asking us to formulate our own argument. Rather, we are going to be just studying the author's argument. So I guess a metaphor for this would be like, let's say you want to be an artist and you're going to art school and you're taking classes. In the very beginning, you're not necessarily creating a lot of original new work. Most of the time, artists start off by studying the masters, studying the classic artworks, studying the classic styles, and then often studying artists themselves to see how did they achieve this balance of light and dark? How did that sculpture, that artist create that sculpture? How did they imbue their work with specific symbolism, etc.? So we're basically doing that, but for arguments rather than works of art or artists. So we're doing that for authors, for speakers, rather than for the artists themselves. And then we want to pull, after we've written a thesis statement, again, thesis statement should be like one single sentence. We're really not looking to write, an entire essay about their overall argument, but what is the point that the author is trying to make? That is their thesis, right? Just like when you write a thesis statement, it's your overall purpose in writing your essay. What is their overall purpose in writing this work? Whether it's a book, whether it's an article, even a thing like a TED Talk, each of those is going to have a sort of central thesis that might not be stated directly. And so it might be up to us when performing a rhetorical analysis to identify what that thesis statement is. After that, we pull direct evidence from the text. I have probably mentioned that I'm a big fan of using quotations. I think quotations form the best forms of evidence, particularly when doing a rhetorical analysis, because we can see the exact words that the author is using. And then rather than analyzing what's the significance of this quote, we're actually going to be looking for an explanation. It's a little bit different of how that feature does or does not help to achieve the author's purpose. So how does it help to further their purpose towards their intended goal of persuading their audience of their main idea, aka their thesis? And then finally, we have a one-sentence conclusion that summarizes your argument and provides a final evaluation of the text. This is, and you'll see there's an example in the assignment this week that sort of provides a final evaluation of whether or not the author is successful in persuading their audience. So rhetorical analysis is we're going to take a look at somebody's argument and we're going to see, did they succeed or not in persuading their audience of the point that they're trying to make in this text, in this work. If it's a book, and we might be looking at like a chapter. If it's an article, we might be looking at an article. Those tend to be slightly easier to kind of break down in the form of a rhetorical analysis. So every claim that you make should have evidence that is from the text to back it up. So if we're making a claim that they successfully persuaded their audience of their point, we need to show how they did it by making by backing up our point with evidence from the text. And again, I'm going to suggest using quotations, especially for a rhetorical analysis structure. So to prepare, you want to read the text. Obviously, we have to have read the text before we can perform an analysis of whether or not it was successful. And then you plan to analyze, both with the grain and then against the grain. So if you're reading with the grain, then you believe everything the author tells you without question. You read it over, basically absorbing everything, believing it to be a true fact, very persuasive, etc. You kind of are like, you can be for a minute, you can be sort of open-minded, curious, even naive, you might say, just for the exercise of what can I take away from how they formulate their argument if I am open to the claims that they're making. And then you read it again against the grain, where instead you're reading it to pose challenges to the author's claims and techniques. And what I run up against a lot in my classes is students haven't necessarily been taught that they are allowed to disagree with the author, or that they don't have to take on the author's perspective on any subject. You've most likely read some things that you did not agree with, or you did not find the author to be particularly persuasive. If that's the case, then you might actually enjoy the exercise of being invited to read against the grain and pose challenges to the author's claims and their techniques to persuade their intended audience. Action. So to go back to the earlier part of the structure, we start with a short summary. You want to construct a short summary of the author's main argument. The summary should simply and neutrally present the author's main point, and then we follow that up with the thesis. What is the author's main point or points that they're trying to convey to their audience? And when I say short, I really mean short. It does not need to be very long. Take a look at the example if you want to see more of what I'm talking about. And then in the analysis, we look at the purpose and the audience that underlie everything that the author writes. So we're always keeping in mind that they have a purpose in writing this and they have an intended audience. Think about how the audience would react to their choices and what questions and logical conclusions they might draw. So if you would like to, the original rhetorical analyses is something that comes like from, the ancient Greek philosophy, where they would take a look at an argument, usually given in the form of a speech, because there wasn't a lot of reading and writing back then, and think about how the audience would react to those choices and what questions or sort of logical conclusions, even poking at some of the logic. And this is going to help prime your brain to practice some of the skills we will learn in future lessons about logic, reasoning, and rhetorical strategies for persuading an audience. And the reason we do this is to break down, again, analysis refers to breaking down into smaller pieces, the author's argument, and reading between the lines. So we're kind of moving into that phase of reading between the lines in this level. And then later on, we'll read beyond the lines when we take our understanding and apply it to a new situation. So the purpose or rhetorical situation refers to the things that are motivating the author to write this piece. So these are some questions you can ask yourself. I recommend reading the text beforehand and then asking these questions, or read these questions and then have them in mind as you are reading. But this is a newish approach, so it might not feel very natural for many of you, and that's okay. There's nothing wrong. Is the author intending to express a certain idea or opinion? Are they trying to respond to a particular occasion or perhaps another text? A lot of times, articles like in newspapers are in response to a previous article. So there's kind of this ongoing academic conversation. Maybe some of you recall that from the beginning of the semester when we talked about entering the academic conversation. Are they exploring a topic or inquiring into a problem? There's a lot of times with the reason that authors are writing things is that they are inquiring into a problem or something that they see to be worthy of further exploration. Is their intention to inform the reader about a topic that is commonly misunderstood? Another common reason for writing something, to inform the reader. And there can also be multiple reasons why someone might write a text or perform a speech or something like that. Are they attempting to analyze, synthesize, or interpret data? So a lot of times when we see sort of popular science books, what they've done is taken research studies that have been done in labs at universities, and they take this information and they sort of synthesize it and then interpret it in such a way that it could be understood by the average person who maybe doesn't have a degree in science. They could read it and they can understand it, rather than asking the public or asking the reading population, the audience, to navigate through these like complicated lab reports or published articles in academic journals, which we are eventually going to do. But at this stage, we're just looking at how are these translated for the sort of broader, larger general population. Are they attempting to persuade the reader of an argument? If you can identify what the argument is, then you can identify whether or not they are trying to persuade and the method they are going to use to persuade, and then find evidence of that in the text. Are they reflecting on a topic? Are they advocating for change? And again, there can be multiple reasons for the author being motivated to write this piece. And it's also somewhat up to our subjective analysis, which is kind of cool, because you might feel that the author is trying to inform the reader about a topic that's misunderstood, and somebody else is going to argue that they are advocating for change. And those two things are not mutually exclusive. They could both exist within the same text. But the key is to look at, can we find evidence that can point to the author is trying to inform the reader about a topic that's misunderstood? And we can see that here in this piece of evidence when they are formulating that purpose. Okay. So again, it's about the structure. How are they achieving their goal? And we're going to look at the underlying pieces of the puzzle. And then finally, we have the audience and the angle of vision. So this refers to who is the audience for this text. Reading through the text through the intended audience's point of view is essential because rhetorical decisions change depending on the audience. So, if an article is being written for the New York Times about something political, then it might have a pretty broad audience. Whereas if something is being written for a scientific journal, then it might be able to be more specific and more technical, use more technical information because it's expected that the people who are reading that scientific journal would be able to understand research methodologies that someone who just likes to read articles in the newspaper might not be familiar with. And then think also about is the audience a specific group of people, and how is the various evidence or the language presented in such a way as to be most persuasive to that audience. The angle of vision is how does the author control what the reader sees? So every author is making choices consciously or subconsciously about what information they share with the reader. So in other words, where does the author use words with certain connotations or create a certain tone or style? And how does the author reveal her point of view? So one of the things that I think is really useful for students is to recognize that a lot of times we can project onto the author of what we're reading. We project a lot of things. We make a lot of assumptions. So the angle of vision is an opportunity to actually take a look at those things and look at those assumptions and notice how are those assumptions being kind of interwoven into the text through certain words that they are using, through certain types of evidence. That's a very common way for the author to sort of control what information is revealed, or to create a certain tone or a certain style. So depending on the author, sometimes authors are really open about their own personal connections to their topic. Other times they might hide and remain somewhat of a sort of neutral observer of the topic. How does that affect the persuasiveness of their argument? And finally, the reason why we do this is to learn the features of how effective argumentation is created in order to apply them to your own argumentative writing. So during this exercise, we're really just looking at the author and their purpose and how they are conveying that to their audience. And then later, by doing that, by studying the elements of how that argument is made, we can then apply it to our own argumentation building, our own argument building, in the same way that I mentioned an art student might study the great works of art or the great artists throughout history. One of the reasons that they do that is in order to then later be able to apply some of those principles to their own creation of art. So it's the same principle here. We are going to be studying how authors form effective arguments in order to later create our own effective arguments in future writing assignments. So that is how to write a rhetorical analysis. That's what you're going to be doing this week. Don't be intimidated by the term rhetorical analysis. It really just means that we're going to take a look at an author's argument, break it down, see how they created their argument, what evidence they used, and whether or not they were successful in persuading their audience. Well, I hope I've been persuasive here today, and thanks for watching.